Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 77 of Ancient Office Hours. This week, I shared a delightful conversation with Dr. Natalie van Deusen, a professor of Scandinavian Studies at the University of Alberta. Her research interests include Old Norse Icelandic paleography and philology, manuscript culture, hagiography and religious literature, and women's and gender studies. Her most recent research has examined early modern poetry on famous and infamous women from the Bible, history, saga literature, as well as saints and their function. She teaches a variety of courses on Nordic history, literature, and culture from the Middle Ages to the present. In this episode, we discussed how to be a philologist and navigate runes in Old Norse studies, whether female warriors like Lagertha from Vikings could have existed, and we got a crash course on Norse mythology, from the Valkyries and Freya to Freya's cats and the giants. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. You can also subscribe to our Patreon, as this will allow us to reach more people and make more exciting ancient world content. Enjoy! Thanks so much for joining me today. I know it's been a bit of a hectic summer, I think. So I want to just kind of jump right in and ask what I hope will be a nice, easy question to sort of get into it, which is, what age or when do you remember getting into the study of ancient history? And did you start with an interest in Scandinavian studies, Viking stuff, or did it start with something else?
My interest in, I think, more pre-modern, medieval, ancient studies, I think is probably when I was maybe 15 or so. And a few years before that, I'd read a book called Number the Stars by Lois Lowry, and I became sort of obsessed with Denmark and decided that I wanted to learn to speak Danish. And I lived in Minnesota, and we had these Concordia language villages, and they had a Danish camp. And so my parents were like, okay, great, we'll send you to this language camp. And so I sort of started with an interest in Scandinavia generally and in that area and in the language. But we did, a number of, activities, and I ended up going to 3 years of what was essentially a full year of high school language credit smashed into 1 month. And we covered some of sort of the medieval period and mythology. And I became really fascinated by that and just decided that I'd keep going with it when I had eventually went to undergraduate and then beyond that, grad school.
That's so cool. You've sparked a lot of memories, because I did one of the Concordia language villages. In hindsight, I kind of wish I'd taken a risk and done a different foreign language. I grew up speaking French, so it was more just to brush up. It's really cool to learn that they have a Danish one. I mean, little sidetrack, do they do other Scandinavian languages? Do they have a Swedish one?
They have Swedish and Norwegian. And when I was an undergraduate, I worked at the Norwegian one because my undergraduate didn't have Danish, and Norwegian's pretty closely related. So I was studying that, and I went to work at the Norwegian one for 1 year. So. Oh,
that's so cool. Oh, I guess I got into it too late to go and do a cool language that I hadn't just no clue about. But yeah, no, mine was all sadly too conventional. But anyway, okay, so 15, nice, what is it? That's midway through, sophomore year of high school, something like that. Since you were kind of getting into it already by this point, was it easy to pick up and keep going with and find wide availability for the languages and the other stuff that would help you as you were going on in your academic path? Because I think a lot of classics majors find that since there aren't a lot of programs in Latin and Greek, is not really easy. And since you don't really speak Latin or ancient Greek, it's real hard. And you got to have someone who knows what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, my interest at first was, I became interested in, the medieval period in Scandinavia. And, but, I not so much that I was I'm going to study this at the undergraduate level. My idea was going into undergraduate, I sort of sought out school I went to, which was Concordia College, that the language villages are associated with because of the availability of languages. And I thought I'm going to, pair kind of language study with something like practical, like accounting or something. And that lasted like a semester before I bailed on that. And I ended up taking a course in religious studies because those are mandatory at these, these liberal arts schools that are associated with a religious, have this religious affiliation. And I was sort of like, I don't really want to take this. I'm not really looking forward to this. Everybody has to. And I kind of thought, just want to get this out of the way. But it ended up being like nothing like what I expected. And it ended up being my favorite class. And in that class, I was introduced to a lot of like writings from, medieval Christianity and medieval women, specifically like mystics and visionaries. And so I started to sort of put the two interests together, like gender and women in medieval Scandinavia, especially in that period of transition from pre-Christianity to Christianity. So it kind of, it sort of evolved from this interest in the geographical region to all of a sudden I'm introduced to this new way of sort of looking at religious studies as, the study of like humans and what they believe, and as opposed to what I thought it was, which was something, very different, my perception of it. And I was so fascinated by this period in history. And then I wasn't able to study Old Norse and Latin until I went to graduate school. It wasn't until then that I really sort of dove in. I was reading everything in translation.
Sadly, it's still a big problem. I was having a great conversation the other day with somebody just about how accessibility is really hard. Normally, I mean, most of my friends happen to be either Egyptologists or obviously other classicists, but I do like to dig into some of the other ancient fields because I feel like sometimes we don't talk about it enough. I mean, just from a casual, like outsider observation, if I talk to someone now who's like, oh yeah, I really like the Vikings and I want to study them in undergrad, it doesn't seem like there's like a lot of places where you can just go do that. I mean, no one has like an Old Norse department. I feel like, isn't it kind of squeezed into just Scandinavian studies sort of umbrella, and then you have to like piecemeal your way to study what you want. I'm sure, it's different now than even, 5-10 years ago, but like, is this a problem that is can it get worse actually? Cause it's pretty bad right now, but like,
Well, I mean, it's absolutely, and I think like it's definitely like a problem within the North American context. I think like in Scandinavia, they don't have any problem teaching about this because it's their country's histories, and there's a lot of support for teaching on these periods. But you're absolutely right, and that was the problem that I encountered in my undergraduate. Is I was interested in this area. I took a course on Norse mythology and the Viking Age, but that's as deep as you could go. And it was sort of within a general Scandinavian studies program. And it was very much sort of a survey course. And there wasn't capacity to go in any more depth. And that's, I think, generally, with the exception of a few universities that have graduate programs in Scandinavian studies. So UW-Madison, where I went, Berkeley, and Washington, University of Washington. And I think Harvard also has like a Germanic program. Those are a few exceptions where you can delve in more specifically into like Old Norse language, manuscript studies, special topics in Old Norse literature and the Viking Age. But otherwise, like it is generally like, it generally comes from within a Scandinavian studies program, which are pretty few and far between in North America, and are, as many humanities fields are, constantly under threat, having to justify our existence. Yeah, so it certainly is an issue. And, sometimes I think the Viking Age can be taught as part of like the history within the British Isles and Old English as well. But I think oftentimes, even when people talk about Northern Europe, it doesn't even mean Scandinavia. So it's really peripheral to, to most kind of conventional, surveys of history. So, that's a long answer, but I think it absolutely is an issue that, and it's one that, like, even though I'm a specialist in Old Norse literature, I I still, can't go too far beyond the general survey course because there just isn't time. And there's, I'm the only full professor in Scandinavian, and so I have to teach other classes as well. So yeah, there's these a myriad of issues that make it difficult. And so it's often students sending them on to further study, in Scandinavia and Iceland or Norway or Denmark or Sweden.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the troubles don't really end there. There's so many other ones, at least in our system. So I'm curious then, so since you're going through this as well, when there's not, a lot of options either, when you make the decision and get to that grad level, because you didn't have a ton of exposure beyond like a basic intro course, how did you go about figuring out exactly what to specialize in? Because I feel like once you get to the place where there's more of like a bigger buffet, let's say, I feel like you could get really easily overwhelmed with, but they have this now and this and this and this, and I want to do it all. So how did you do that? Absolutely.
And so like the nice thing about my grad program is like everybody had to take courses everybody had to take Old Norse. Everybody had to take, these certain classes that were regardless of what you were going to specialize in, whether it was going to be, Scandinavian linguistics or, philology or, looking at modern Norwegian literature. Everybody had to take Old Norse. And so that was a nice way of sort of testing the waters and figuring out like, I think I want to do this, but do I really have the chops for it? Because, it's Old Norse language and it's not easy. And, and I mean, it's a little bit like when I took that religion class that I had no idea would, kind of open up this whole, basically what has become my career in terms of what I study. And so it does give you the chance to, sort of get a broad overview, because the reality for people in graduate school for Scandinavian studies is you'll likely be the only person teaching in your area in the department that you're in. And so you'll have to teach pretty much everything. So you do have to get sort of exposure to everything from, Viking Age to crime fiction. So that is a nice way of figuring out what it is that you want to do. But you sort of have to be, able to do it all.
Yeah, it sounds pretty hard. Now, I am curious as a philologist. I'm coming from studying Greece and Rome, where we have a ton of texts and other written materials. My perception from outside the field for Old Norse studies is that these cultures were mainly like they revolved on oral tradition, right? So is it quite hard to be a philologist if you do Old Norse studies, because we don't have just the sheer volume that you would find in classics?
Yeah, in some ways it is. I mean, the situation in Scandinavia was that it was, and the areas where most of the literature was written down, which was predominantly Iceland, was that these texts, we usually talk about the sagas, but also poetry, they were transmitted orally. They were developed orally and then transmitted orally for sometimes 200 to 300 years, and then they were written down once Christianity came and introduced the Latin alphabet. The runic alphabet was available before, but was not used for any sort of long narratives. And so you have this, issue of texts that are being written down after this long period of oral transmission, but there is quite a large volume of texts that are preserved in Iceland. So Iceland has a very rich manuscript tradition. They have most of the works about kind of the Viking Age, Norse mythology, and stories that were told about the original settlers of Iceland and important people who lived during the Viking and Middle Ages in Scandinavia were produced in Iceland and were kept. So despite it going through, really kind of very difficult times in terms of volcanic eruptions and famines, they were a highly literate nation. And so there were farmers and, kind of everyday people who were copying these texts, even in the Middle Ages, and beyond, and keeping them as sort of these treasured objects. So it's very different, I think, from working with texts in like Latin and Greek. And we deal a lot more with, a lot of variation in orthography, I think, a lot more so than you would see. We rely a lot on orthographic evidence to sort of date a text, because you can see the development of language happening as well. But yeah, there is quite a lot, especially in Iceland. And there was a continuation of what I find fascinating is that people kept copying things well after the well after the printing press was established, people were still copying things by hand. And so you have this continuity of copying down saga literature and medieval texts well into sometimes like, the 19th century.
That's so cool. And you mentioned runes. And so something that I always wanted clarification on. So when talking to like Assyriologist friends of mine, I would talk sort of about, oh, it's so cool, cuneiform. And I realized I didn't like know what it was until they sat me down and they were like, it's a writing system. It's like alphabetic, but it's not just like you sit down and you read a French newspaper. They're like, no, it doesn't work that way. And so I think a lot of people don't also understand how runes work. Because if I were to sit down, I'd be like, oh yeah, runes. I guess it's like any other ancient foreign language. You just read. So can you tell us, is it more of just, it is a writing system that you have to sort of navigate and put together because, one rune might be a sound, not an actual word? Because I think the last time I talked to somebody about it, they said, oh yes, they showed me a rune and they were like, this is the word for, and I was like, but is it? In terms of like each rune has like a name. And so it's like a letter form, but it's equivalent to a name. And that's something kind of like thorn or something like that. But I mean, it's an alphabet. It was a system of writing. And as far as we know, it was used for commemorative purposes, like usually like this stone was erected in honor of so-and-so who died in this battle here, or this stone was erected in honor of, this woman named, this woman who was the handiest maiden in this area of Norway or something like that. There's also some things that have survived on wood, but yeah, so each rune does have a name, as it's referred to, but it's not as though it's like a cryptic sort of thing as far as it was used in the Middle Ages. It sort of becomes like, it gets picked up a little bit later on in Iceland as sort of like this encoded language, these different cryptic alphabets, and they sort of adapt the runes in that way, but that's much later. And certainly they don't have this mystical or like function that you see like as they've been sort of picked up in New Agey circles. I often get, emails from people that want to get tattoos or something and say like, I've heard that this rune symbolizes this or this or this. And usually I'll kind of just say that, that's not historically what runes were or what they represented. There's some, evidence of magical functions, but it was an alphabet. Like that's predominantly what it was. Yeah. It only occurred to me to ask, it just goes to the heart of, if you're studying Old Norse studies, I've always wondered, do you have to spend time actually reading things with runes, or is it more of because there's more like medieval Iceland, could you get away with reading more like old Icelandic texts?
Yeah, I think absolutely that. I don't deal much with runes at all because they sort of are they're within their own category. And if I dealt more in my own research with the mythology, then I think runes might be a bigger part of what I do because there are some picture stones with themes from mythology and some sort of legendary and mythological things on runestone that I think it really is dependent on what it is that you do. And if people are interested in some people that do kind of more hardcore historical linguistics do deal more with it to track sort of the evolution of the language, because the runes do represent an earlier period in the language than do the manuscripts, which are reflective of the 12th, 13th centuries when these texts are written down.
Yeah, it's really helpful to be able to have a solid clarification and explanation, because I think it's all too easy to just assume, if I hear somebody studies Old Norse anything, I think there's just a tendency to assume, oh, this must mean that they all deal with runes, not just the specialists, and that this must be the thing that they all read. And so it's very helpful to have someone be like, no, it is actually its own thing. All of us, we don't just do this. So no, it's super, super helpful. But yeah, going a little more into some of your research areas. I think I read somewhere that you've done some work on women and gender studies. And so I'm going to ask maybe a stupid question, but again, not in the field, so it's fine. And I don't know if any of my audience knows any of this anyway. But I think in especially the last couple years, there's a increased fascination with exactly some of the roles that women were able to do during, let's just be nice and say, anywhere between the 9th and 11th, 12th centuries. Let's go with that. I think especially after the Assassin's Creed Valhalla game came out, because you could play as a female protagonist. Now, I know there's not like a ton of evidence. There's nothing that we're going to find that's just going to be like, yes, and women were this and they did that. But I wanted to ask you, just since you do research on this subject, is it possible, like women warriors, how likely is it that we had them and could have done what we see like in this video game?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's definitely like come into like the sort of popular, discourse because of, everything from Marvel to gaming, and also like some of the popularity of certain archaeological finds. There was the Birka find, which was a burial of a woman whose DNA was, it was identified as being female, and she was buried with weapons. And so this like kind of got everybody really excited, and so that this is really confirmation that women did participate in warfare. But that came under quite a lot of criticism, especially by a scholar named Judith Jesch, who has written some of the best stuff out there on women in the Viking Age from like the historical standpoint, about sort of how we need to sort of be cautious about these types of examples and take them in conjunction, and kind of the importance of interdisciplinarity when looking at these things. So sure, we have this find of a woman buried with a sword and, armor, but there could be many reasons for this. And this should be taken in conjunction with other evidence, like the literary evidence, which makes it pretty clear that women were not supposed to wield weapons. And, according to law, they were prohibited from doing so. There are accounts of battles where women and children are going into shelter. Any kind of accounts in the saga literature where women do, like kind of the more historical saga literature where they do try to wield weapons, they usually botch the job. They don't do it very well. So it's sort of thought that, perhaps that would be amazing if that were the case, but probably the exception, not the rule. And there's some there's some Johanna Katrin Friedrichsdottir has written a book called Valkyrie, which is really good and is geared towards more popular audiences. She's also written a book, a more scholarly book on women and gender in the in medieval Scandinavia. But she talks about gender performativity and as something to consider as well. There's one body of literature that people often point to, and I think where these ideas of women warriors come from. So they're the legendary sagas as well as the mythological literature, which is kind of, and this is what Johanna has talked about in her book, it's sort of the medieval equivalent or their equivalent of like fantasy literature. So it's the space where they had Valkyries and they had maiden kings, women who, ruled as men and, took on almost a male name and fought in wars, but always temporarily. They were eventually, after they'd kind of gotten out of the systems, they always had to get married. But that's a whole other thing. It's sort of like this space that it's allowed to happen where there's also dragons and other really fantastical things going on, that it's clearly sort of this imaginative space. It's something that is certainly possible, but I think the general consensus right now is that that would have been like generally like an exception for women to fight alongside men. And, according to the law, it was only freeborn men who could own and wield weapons. Sadly, I hate bursting people's bubbles about that, because I think there's this sort of fantasy about the Viking Age and about, women in it. And I think in some ways, compared to elsewhere in Europe, like women did have, not by modern standards, they didn't have it good by any means, but they did have the right to like divorce, for example. They could divorce with just cause, and they had to provide consent to marriage, and they had complete sort of control over the domestic sphere. So there are some things that, it's not nearly as exciting as like a woman being on the battlefield, I think. But
so basically no Lord of the Rings style shield maiden Eowyn-esque thing.
Exactly. I mean, like Eowyn, it would have been like the exception. It would have been somebody who like, she, you know what I mean? Because she was like, she wasn't doing it like with anybody knowing she was doing it. It would have probably been something like that. there's ideas about like this woman who was buried with her weapons. It could have been her husband's weapons. It could have been like a mark of, honor, prestige, or status or something to have been buried with these grave goods. But yeah, so I mean, this again, it would have been in some ways, I mean, Eowyn is maybe a good example of like, if this did happen, it would have probably been a little bit like that, very much the exception.
Because I was about to ask, I want to know out of two things, which one would be more likely to hew closer to history, which would have been Eowyn, who, yes, like we saw in kind of the lead up to the third Lord of the Rings, that like, yeah, she had tendencies. She was kind of headstrong. She wanted to fight. She didn't really do much until she hid herself and then fought. Take someone like Lagertha, right, from the Vikings show. There's none of this, I'm going to hide and no one's going to see me as I'm fighting. She's all like, pow, pow, pow. Hi, I'm a badass shield maiden. I'm just going to go kill people.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the Lagertha-like character is much more unlikely to have been something that occurred in reality, just based on what the other sources tell us. And kind of, I mean, there's a literary and historical sources, the written sources that very much indicate that this was kind of the realm of men, was warfare. And I mean, even the word Vikinger is a male noun, like with the R at the end. It's it was a male profession.
At least it's fun to see and fantasize our Lagerthas. Although I heard she was based on what people think might have been either one or two different women. Do you know anything about that? The women she's supposed to be based on?
Yeah, I think she was supposed to be based on a woman who was in a Danish history by Saxo Grammaticus. She was recorded in that text. That's sort of where that came from. I don't know as much about that text specifically. So it's one of these, like, she's based on a figure from history, but, very much fiction in terms of the details of her life. So it's from Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, which is from the 12th century. He mentions Ragnar and Lagertha. So it's kind of taken from that, so it's based on some history, but and some literature. And she's described, sort of being like an Amazon in that text.
Interesting. Oh, so okay, that the immediate comparison my brain is going to then is so she must be like the Old Norse equivalent to Penthesilea, right, from Greek mythology, because our Amazons are, they're not the norm either, because women warriors in ancient Greece, not really, but you have Penthesilea.
Yeah, and what's interesting, like with a lot of these, and it's like Johanna Katrin Friedrichsdottir, who I mentioned before, she talked about this type of woman that's like called a maiden king. It's sort of, this is a character type, and they're women who like they fight and they act as men, but they have within their story, they're never allowed to stay in that state permanently. They always have to get married, and a lot of the stories about them are them trying to resist marriage and, often being subjected to a lot of horrible things in the process. And they always eventually succumb. And it's sort of like you can occupy this space temporarily, and that's fine, but this cannot be a permanent occupation. And I had a student who actually did a presentation on Eowyn as sort of modeled on that story type, because she eventually reoccupies her position as, a royal daughter, and, she has her dress on at the end again and everything like that. And she's not fighting anymore. And she's coupled up with somebody, and it's a fantasy, and it's something that you could think about, but, it's never a full-time permanent occupation for women, even within the fantasy realm. So
since women didn't really, I mean, with the obvious sort of maybe exception around, we hear a lot, and especially thanks to the Thor Marvel movies, I guess. I think a greater amount of people, right, are sort of discovering, and they love the character King Valkyrie, which I find hilarious that her name is King Valkyrie, even though she's a woman. And I was like, my brain hurts. But okay, so for all of us who we think we sort of know what or who a Valkyrie is, can you tell us what are they supposed to actually represent? Because if women aren't supposed to be in this realm, we might sit here and think, well, it's kind of weird then that you would have these women take up a very important part and be mentioned a lot.
Right. No, exactly. So Valkyrie literally means chooser of the slain. So, and they were this host of women who were kind of written about in a way that sort of has it so that they're riding over the battlefields usually, and they're choosing the slain who are going to go to Valhalla, the Einherjar, which means the chosen slain. They choose, and they're gonna, they kind of ride over the battlefield. They choose these chosen slain, and these warriors who are selected to become Einherjar are brought to Valhalla, where they prepare for Ragnarok, or the end of the world. So they kind of feast on never-ending mead and meat, and they fight all day and then regenerate and do it all again the next day. So they kind of are depicted as these riding above the battlefield and choosing the warriors who die in battle and are going to go to Odin's Hall, Valhalla, which is Hall of the Slain, and fight in preparation for Ragnarok. And in the more legendary literature, they're often, the heroic literature, they're often like lovers of certain heroes, and they kind of they're oftentimes like in stories that are kind of related to mythology, sort of the heroic literature. They're women oftentimes who were princesses and sort of chose the Valkyrie life, but again, sort of always temporarily, and they end up having to go back to, getting married or something like that. So like the Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, I think is maybe like sort of one of the best examples of that with Brünnhilde. There's the German equivalent with the Nibelungenlied. She's Brünnhilde. Like in her story, they're associated with Odin. In her story, she had upset Odin by taking the wrong side in a matter, and he put her in this like sleep spell. But so she's an example of sort of one of these like royal women who chose the Valkyrie lifestyle for a little while, but eventually she gets married like they all do, like the Maiden Kings.
So they have this interesting pride of place, but also it's interesting to learn they're temporary then, because I think the impression we get, right, is that they stay around for like I don't know, I feel like you always have them, but I guess I didn't realize it wasn't like the same lady.
It really depends on the text. So within the mythology, there isn't the sense that these are like princesses who like act as Valkyries. So like the Poetic Edda, for example, it's one of our main sources for Norse mythology, early 13th century manuscript. And like the first part is like strictly mythological texts. And the second is like heroic poetry. And it has to do with like Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, and the gods sort of play roles in these. So in the more strictly mythological literature, you get the sense that they're more like deities who, ride above the battlefield, and they're and they have this role, and you don't have that sense of temporality in they have to reintegrate into a social order of some kind. But once you get into the more human world, we're entering the royal courts and human issues, as opposed to being strictly within the mythological realm with the gods and Asgard, and the Valkyries take on a slightly different form.
I'm curious, is there any like greater, bigger significance that I may be missing, that those who are the ones who will like select the slain to go to Valhalla are women? Like, is there something I'm missing, or is it like, I don't know, it's always been like, oh, why is it the women who pick?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I mean, like they also they have once they bring them to Valhalla, they're also in charge of serving them mead at Valhalla. So they're not like just like purely this, sort of like really cool, riding chariots over the battlefield type of function. They have to perform what is very much a stereotypically female role in Old Norse society, which is even the goddesses do in Norse mythology. They have to serve, hospitality being this really important virtue, as far as we can tell from the literature, in Viking Age and medieval Scandinavia. So like you have even the Valkyries like doing that. So reflective of like these cultural values of, the importance of hosting and domestic work. Even though they have this like really, badass warfare persona, they still have to serve the meat.
Oh man, that's like, it's like you get the best job in the world, and then they're like, oh, but there's a caveat, you're also doing this. So it's kind of like a bait and switch.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, there's still some kind of you can still tell that there's gender hierarchy based on that. It's not like it's very clear that there's a specific place for women, even if they're goddesses, even if they're kind of almost deity-like figures, sort of pseudo deities like Valkyries are.
I didn't plan to go down such a rabbit hole for the mythology, but you know what? I'm enjoying it so much that I was like, I'm going to just keep this train going, because it's always sparking so many great questions. So the next one I will pose is, so because there seems to be such a set place for women and their roles, and it's very, hierarchical, I've always wondered, okay, until like 2-3 years ago, I didn't even know that Freya, the goddess Freya, had her own like afterlife field, and she takes half of the dead in battle, right? So I'm like, what? So why does she get her own then? Even like if she's a woman, and do the Valkyries also get to pick who goes to Folkvanger, or not really? Is that just a Valhalla thing?
So she's supposed to receive half the slain, and Freya has kind of a connection to the Valkyries, and she's not a Valkyrie herself, but she's Valkyrie-like. And I don't know, I mean, she herself rides a chariot that's drawn by cats. She's sort of the goddess that's associated with warfare. I mean, Freya, like, there's a lot of interesting things about Freya are, not totally, I think, agreed upon. Like there's, are Freya and Frigg, who is Odin's wife, the same person? But she does have this Valkyrie-like function herself. And yeah, her hall is Folkvanger, and she does take half of the chosen slain. It's unclear exactly why, but it's like, she reflects Odin in a lot of ways. It's like Odin is a god of war. He's a god of, but he's also the god of wisdom and the god of poetry, and the god of death. And so Freya, similarly, she's the goddess of love and fertility, but also she has this battle function in terms of her relationship too. So she almost is sort of, she mirrors Odin in a lot of ways. There's always the idea that Freya and Frigg are the same person, therefore Freya is female equivalent to Odin as like a spouse potentially. But again, there's no like real consensus. The sources don't necessarily agree and tell the same story on this at all. There's no sort of one canonical source. There's a lot of different sources that sometimes say different things, and that's a tricky bit about Norse mythology, because of the oral tradition. Like almost certainly, it's sort of developed in all these different ways, and one text will tell us one thing about a figure who was aired, another one we'll have somebody else entirely, and slightly different accounts of the same stories. We have all these variants on not just the mythology, but other texts as well. So a lot of versions of the same stories.
I'm curious, maybe it could just come down honestly to hierarchy, and because it was a man's world, that's just the way it was. But I feel like when I read stuff or hear stuff, I really don't hear anything about talking about the privilege of ending up in Folkvanger. It's not like a bad place, right? Isn't it supposed to still be like a kind of like nice place? So like, why don't they talk about that more? Like, I know, okay, fine, everyone was like Odin, Valhalla, but I'm like, if Folkvanger's kind of like sort of samesies, why do they not be like, it's okay, I could go there too?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's mentioned in so few sources. Like, I think it's like only like maybe like a couple of the sources that we have. There's like, I think one poem that mentions it, and then Snorri Sturluson in his prose edit mentions it very briefly, saying that that's Freya's hall. So there just isn't much information about it. And there's, I mean, the most likely situation is that like anything we might have known about it is like lost to us forever, as are so many other sources. Because I always talk to my students about how what we have about mythology, it's like you have a puzzle, right? Like, but you only have like 1/6 or 1/7 of the pieces, right? Like you don't, and then you're trying to piece together what the whole picture looked like, but you don't have all the pieces. And that's very much the situation with Norse mythology. So much, it's very clear that there were more poems and more sources that are like Snorri Sturluson refers to things like a poem called Heimdall's Chant, which it doesn't exist anywhere, so it either went up in flames at, the big fire in Copenhagen, or it's at the bottom of the ocean somewhere because the manuscripts were taken from Iceland back to mainland Scandinavia, or it just was lost entirely. It's hard to say whether there's any, whether you can ascribe any meaning to people talking more about Valhalla than Folkvanger, just because of, the issue of sources.
Like most things in ancient history, you want an answer? Well, we don't have it, so guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's depressing to me as somebody who works. I work predominantly with manuscripts. That it's depressing to think about when I start to think too much about how much is lost. I mean, it's amazing the amount that has survived, and I mean, Iceland especially had sort of an unparalleled vernacular literary culture in the Middle Ages that was super productive. And we do have a lot, but there was so much more at one point. The different charters and things that tell us about, this monastery, that lists, it's kind of itemizes what it had and its ownership, and it'll talk about all the books, and it makes it very clear that, there was so much more. But I also think that kind of it makes Norse mythology and some of these other things like a really interesting space to imagine what might have been. And I think that maybe is one of the reasons that medieval and, and ancient worlds are of such interest in sort of popular culture, is because you can imagine more. I think there is more space to imagine what might have been, because we don't have everything. So you can kind of, I think that, this is a possibility. So that's one idea. Because I mean, I'm always thinking about why we're so fascinated by this period, and why, pop culture continually turns to it. I think that might be one of the reasons. There's just more space.
I would agree. I mean, it's quite interesting because when you almost sort of do a comparison, right, for what we turn to or what we like to look at, I feel like, there is this intense fascination with Norse mythology because to the casual eye, right, it's bonkers. I mean, like goddesses in a chariot pulled by cats, and then you're like, little tiny cats that are like 6 or 7 ounces. And then you're like, no, like they're massive giants. And you're like, what? Yeah, to the casual eye, Norse mythology is bonkers. And because of the lack of text, you can go anywhere with it. But also you do have tons of stuff. Well, not tons, but like stuff preserved from ancient Egypt, where their mythology is also bonkers. I mean, like Greco-Roman mythology is the only one that kind of sort of seems a bit, I guess, like closer to us, but there's just more there. But yeah, it's interesting because when I think of like Egyptian and Norse, I'm like, yeah, those are the two that are strange, and I think there's more room for us to interpret and kind of figure out what we want to do. This is going to be a very me-centric question. I love cats more than anything. So Freya's chariot drawn by cats. I'm just very curious as a cat person. Did the Vikings like cats? Did they see the utility of them like the Egyptians, and they were just very popular? Because I'm like, why cats? This is awesome, but why cats?
I agree. I also I'm a big, I have a cat, and I love cats. So I mean, there's it was known that Viking raids or expeditions, especially sort of the larger ships, would have cats on them. There was a utility of cats because they would take care of the rats and the mice and the vermin and everything like that in the ships. And so, I mean, it's known that they had cats on the ships with them. So they absolutely had a function. I don't think they were held in the same reverence as maybe some other mythologies as being, but they were absolutely saw utility in them. And I think it's interesting that if you've ever seen a Norwegian forest cat before, yeah, I mean, they're thought to be Maine Coons are thought to be potentially related to them. I mean, who knows? I have no idea. But I've heard this theory that because, the Norse came to Newfoundland and that part of the world, that potentially that introduced that species, and that's what Maine Coons are ultimately descended from. I have no idea whether that's true or not. They are big. They're really big cats. So I always think of Freya's big cats. I'm like, that's not so off, because they're big. They're giant. These our cat is, I think he might be part Maine Coon. He's just this big orange fluffy boy.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, they're massive. I didn't know about them until 2015, and then I studied for a semester in Edinburgh. And they have a cat cafe that I would frequent quite often. And they had 2 enormous Norwegian forest cats. And one was a totally white one. And he had beautiful eyes, and I loved him. And he would come and snuggle on my lap. Okay, obviously I have 10,000 million questions. So I'm going to try to limit myself and keep it to one more good one. I am curious about giants, right? Giants in Norse mythology. And because it's so different from everything else, because when they describe the gods, I feel like some of the sources ascribe this deity-like thing as like they're actually magical beings, and some they seem almost more humans who just live a long time. And then because it's so segmented into like the sort of deities, whatever X text would describe to them, and then giants. But also it's weird because like the giants are often only women. So I'm like, what is this about? Why is it the giants are like the women?
So giants first is like, it's what the name, so it's singular Jötun, plural Jötnar. It's what it's translated to, but it kind of gives a false perception of what they likely were. They seem to be just another category, like another clan, or sort of like a race, a mythological race, I think is what kind of the general consensus is now. And they are associated with some prophecy and death and infertility as well. So like they don't seem to have a good time, like or an easy time procreating amongst themselves. But they are kind of just this sort of enemy mythological clan, the Aesir and the Vanir, which are a kind of two, categories that merged in a way, right? Like they kind of have an interrelationship with the gods, or with the gods. There's a clear hierarchy that you sort of have the Aesir and the Vanir on top, and the Jötnar are very much, seen as below them. The women, the reason you hear about women so much is because their intermarriage can happen, but only one way, and that it reflects the hierarchy. So gods take women giants as concubines, or if they are sort of the lesser category of gods, the Vanir, they marry them. So like Freyr and his dad Njord, they both marry giantesses. But like Odin, and Odin procreates with a giantess, for example, and that's a fairly common thing. But it never goes the other way around, because that would invert the hierarchy. There's a scholar named John Lindau who's one of kind of the foremost experts in Norse mythology. He talks about it sounds bad, but like a one-way flow of women, but it is, like historically, like a way that, different groups would show dominance over the other. We can, they would take, marry women from the group, but if it happened the other way around, that would signal an inversion of the hierarchy. So you do hear sometimes about male giants, and like Loki is a giant, for example, and the race of giant is patrilineal. So if your father is a giant, then therefore you are. But if your father is a god and your mother's a giant, you're a god. They have this like this weird, it's very much sort of just another category of being, another mythological race, and one that's often at odds with the gods. But they also have a weird interdependence with them as well. But some of the biggest threats to the gods come when male giants kidnap or come very close to marrying goddesses. So they're always after like Freya, or even some of these the goddesses. And that's some of the biggest threats to the gods, because them succeeding in doing that would threaten their hierarchy or their status within the hierarchy. Yeah, so it's not like they're not like giants in the sense of like being these big trolls, like Big Friendly Giant, that Land of Roald Dahl or something like that. But they're really just another category of, kind of a lesser aspect of looking at kind of race, generally race studies within the medieval Scandinavian world, as sort of like a mythological model for that. So I have a grad student who's working on mixed race identities in Old Norse sources, and the mythological literature gives a really interesting sort of like guide for how it might work, and how it should and how it shouldn't work. So,
yeah, I mean, it sounds really cool the way you're describing it, but really not super cool either. So I am very familiar. I know there is that one myth of Thor killing 3 giantesses, I think, because you have a myth like that, and because most of mythology talks about, it's very one way. And the last one I'll limit myself to, though, is what about the rare, powerful one where it seems like she's not going to just roll over and kind of be the god's plaything? Like, isn't there, what's her name? Oh, God. I'm so bad with Norse mythology. Angrboda, right? Isn't she supposed to be kind of like the rare, different one who just isn't a doormat?
Yeah, but she's also bad because her name literally means sorrow bringer. So she's the one that she has with Loki like the three monstrous children, the Midgard serpent, Hel, and Fenrir, the wolf. She's certainly not portrayed in a positive light. I think one of the giantesses that is, sometimes they're like the wife of Njordr, whose name's Skavi. She's kind of almost like a Valkyrie-like figure. Her father gets killed by the gods because of something that Loki set into motion. And, she dons armor and comes and demands retribution for him. And that's how she ends up being married to a god. There's another giantess named Gerður who marries Freyr, who is, portrayed not super negatively, but, they're not portrayed as typically they're not portrayed in a very positive light. They're not portrayed as being particularly, sometimes they're like prophetic, but in other times they're easily tricked. It's not always very consistent. Like the one you're talking about with Thor, he kills them. That's Thor's job is to protect humans and gods from the giants. Yeah, I think there's a myth too where one of the giants wants to marry, the giant's name's Thrymr, and he wants to marry Freya. Loki agrees to it. Without consulting Freya, and she says absolutely not. And so they have Thor dress up as a bride and Loki as his bridesmaid, and then they go and have like a wedding feast, and then they kill the giants, or Thor does at least. It's comedic. He's very obviously Thor in, it's Thor in dressed up in a wedding gown and not at all looking like Freya, but so it's, again, not consistent.
Wow. So it seems like, you might get some respect if you're an evil, powerful giantess, which...
Yeah, exactly. And she's destined to bring like the children. Her name means sorrow bringer. Like, so it does not bode well for her. Like So
bring like Ragnarok, Armageddon, whatever to the gods and yeah, we'll speak of you, powerful good. Well, the last one you were talking about, I think they had a version of that myth in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. One of the DLCs that had to do with I think it was the one where you played in Asgard, because there's one arc where you went and played in Asgard, and there's one where you go to Jotunheim, but I think it was the Asgard one. I think they did a riff on that, but instead of Thor, it was like they had Loki turn into Freya. So the only thing you could tell was different was like the voice. But again, animation, you can do whatever you want in a video game. But I enjoyed how they brought that, I guess. And as someone who studies, Old Norse and clearly has a vast knowledge of the mythology, do you like to watch media and like do stuff in your free time, or do you like to try to delineate work life from like other interests?
So I would say probably the latter. Like I enjoy popular culture, and I really enjoy a lot of the portrayals of the Viking Age and Norse mythology in popular culture. But I think I've come to the conclusion that it's difficult for me to separate then work, because it's somehow like, even though I'm enjoying it, it has me sort of in the realm of the things that I do when I'm thinking and working. So it's that's not the escape that I need. Because I also want to know, like, this is the introductions a lot of my students have had to Norse mythology. So I want to kind of know about that. And I do find it really fun. My, chosen, like media for escape is not the, medieval North or the Viking Age. It's something else.
Nice. Yeah, I don't know. I've noticed a trend that like a lot of people who study the ancient world, they get asked a lot like, oh, so I got asked the other day, oh, so I bet you just want to watch all of the things based on ancient Greece and Rome. And I'm like, well, I enjoy them a lot, and I've had to let go of any type of accuracy really to enjoy it. But I was like, no, my whole life is not just, I don't show up in a toga everywhere I go. I don't have a statuette of Athena on my desk or my bedside table. But it's weird how many people assume like if you study this, then you should be it, right?
I often get like, oh, you must watch Vikings. You must, certainly you've watched Vikings, right? And it's like, actually, I really haven't. And I've tried. And it's like, I have no problem with, like taking liberties with the material. It's nothing about like being a snob about historical accuracy. It's just that I don't find that I can like get the escape that I need.
So, okay, to end the sort of interview portion of the podcast, I have a couple last questions. The first is, when you were a student, either undergrad or grad level, did you attend your professor's office hours? And this could be the informal type of office hours as well.
Absolutely. I loved going to chat with my professors, both in undergraduate and graduate school. And I would attend during office hours, but I would always seek them out, in other, outside of office hours as well. And yeah, that was definitely something I did.
Nice. And do you have a favorite memory of, a cool conversation or experience, something that happened to you during one of these conversations?
Yeah, I have a lot of really, it depends. One of the kind of, I think, formative ones, the early ones, was with the professor I took that religious studies course with, that kind of got me interested in the medieval world. And I had signed up for the class late, like toward the very end of the ad drop period. And because I had originally taken accounting and decided that, no, I hate this. And I'm going to fulfill this requirement instead. And a friend of mine who lived in the same floor happened to be taking this class. And I met with her in office hours. It was like, okay, it's going to be a lot of work to catch up on and all of these things. And I said, oh, that's fine. And she's okay, just so you know. And then a few weeks, further into the semester, I visited her and she encouraged me to continue to pursue this field of study because she was, she thought that I was sort of really meant for studying it, really. And I think that was a really important moment for me, having that recognition from a professor that says, like, I can see that this sparked something in you, and that you have this interest. So you might consider taking this class on mystics and visionaries in the Middle Ages, or further studying this class within the field. So, and then of course in graduate school, my PhD advisor is somebody that's still my friend and mentor. And I had so many amazing conversations with her that were really important. Including the one where I almost quit grad school. I saw the uncertainty of the academic future and I almost quit. Kind of, I guess, maybe strange, but both really formative in their own ways. I think that they really shaped what ended up happening, my life trajectory, in really important ways. And I'm glad she did, that she talked me down from that. Academia is rough. And I know a lot of people I was in grad school with who are brilliant and wonderful and deserving, and there just aren't enough jobs. But I don't think I ever would have regretted getting the PhD.
Well, that's good to know. And I do love hearing about, just like the different impacts that amazing mentors and professors have had. One of my favorites is not even academic. My favorite professor helped me in a lot of ways and advised me how to go through and get through undergrad.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's why I love being a professor too, because it's, you get to fulfill a kind of like a broader role in like a student's life, and I appreciate having that opportunity.
Yeah, no, and so I will say, this is a show called Ancient Office Hours. And so if you had to give students like a 30-second to a minute pitch on why they should attend office hours, what would you say?
I just think it gives students more of a connection to not only the class, but, the instructor, and it helps to personalize the experience in a way. Like some of these classes, you're in a classroom you're one of 100 students, and oftentimes the professors really want to get to know students, but it's like impossible in a class of that size. And I think it helps to really make the most out of the experience in a class, to attend office hours, and not just for reasons of getting clarification on readings, but of just kind of talking more generally about, using that resource for advising. And I've had so many students who, were, among like the 100 students in their class and came to office hours and didn't necessarily specialize in my area, but took my classes like as options, and developed relationships with them, and I write them letters of recommendation, and it sort of has this, and it generally helps you, I think, be motivated to do well in the class, to develop that personal relationship. And it's there for you too, I think. Like, it's there for students, and we, otherwise we just sit there and we hope somebody comes in. So we want you to visit us during our office hours.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because I definitely lived in my two favorite professors' office hours. I think I just bounced from one to the other when one had to teach. So
I thought the same way of thinking about myself. I'm like, oh, I'm always the first one there.
First one there, longest one there, last to leave. Yeah, no, it was a fantastic experience. But anyway, okay. At the end of each podcast, I ask if each guest would read Shelley's Ozymandias poem. And then once you've done so, I would love to know your, opinion on this poem. Has been cited as something quite influential, and people seem to think it quite beautiful. And for me, it was life-changing. But I'd be curious to see if you agree and generally what you think about it.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." It makes me think about generally legacies of figures and words. Yeah, look upon my works and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay. I mean, I'm thinking about our conversation as well about the lost words, the lost manuscripts as well, and that sort of recalls that to me. Of what remains of something that was once much more complete and well and much better understood. But I have to think about it, I think, a lot more. I have to reflect on this a lot more. But I think it's really beautiful.
Yeah, I think, this is a poem that I read, I believe in high school, maybe earlier, but I really can't remember, but definitely high school. And from the first time I read it, it became my favorite poem of all time, which I know is ballsy because we have so much great poetry. But it's a beautifully crafted sonnet. I mean, he crammed so much into 14 lines, and it's beautiful. It's like a memento mori kind of, and the power of monumentality and definitely the ephemeral nature of power, but also political power because it was Ramesses the Great. This guy thought he was going to be king for, well, ever, or at least that his civilization would be around for eternity. Thinking about the poem in that context, the last question I ask every guest, if you stop and think for a moment about our contemporary society right now, do we have like a modern equivalent of an Ozymandias, like something that we think is so great, but like realistically humans in like 500 years, are they going to agree with us? Or are they going to think these people were crazy?
So something that we think is more significant than will be viewed as such in the future, and probably something relating to the internet and the things that opinion pieces or something like that. People, I think what they have to say in some, in these debates, maybe carry a lot more weight than they do. It could be something like that. You think about, these influential Twitter threads and things like that. I wonder how some of those are going to be viewed, 1,000 years longer than that. I have to hope as somebody that produces scholarship that it's going to, be seen as somewhat useful still, if not like necessarily like an incredibly, not necessarily like a super influential thing, but it's something of some importance, not trivial at least. So potentially, something related to online existence. And
yeah, that's a great answer. I've definitely gotten a few people say the internet because I'm like, it's true though, because I mean, people say all the time, oh, well, you don't want to get caught saying this because then if it's on the internet, it'll be there forever. And I'm like, okay, but the internet is like a few massive servers somewhere in like Silicon Valley. And if someone were to pour water on it or short circuit it, then we lose the internet forever. So kind of scary to think about. But okay, so I kind of lied. There is one more question I'm going to ask you, but it's a really easy one. Where can people find you if they would like to see your work or get in touch with you about trying to study Old Norse or anything of the like?
Yeah, if you go to ualberta.ca and just search my name, Natalie Van Deusen, under the search function, it should bring you to my faculty page. And that is probably like the best, most up-to-date place where I keep my publications and things. I did a TikTok page for a little while when I still update it sometimes. And my handle is the low key professor. And I did that while I was teaching mostly remotely, and I was doing summaries of my lectures, 3-minute summaries. So I have some stuff on there too, if you want to see short lessons on a variety of topics.
Great. Well, we'll make sure to link all of those, any of those, in the show notes so people can do so. And we'll put your faculty page in there just so people can go see what you're working on. This has been super fun. I definitely did not mean to do such a deep dive into the mythology, but I got so excited that I couldn't stop. So I'm sure there's like 10,000 more things we didn't get to, but I hope we can have you on sometime in the future. I don't know what it would be yet, but please do come back and speak with us. So thank you once again. It's been so fun.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for reaching out and for having me on.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings.